So Diana, okay, Diana is recording this to go on YouTube later. Usually it's well, later today or tomorrow sometime it'll go on YouTube, and we usually send it out. What's this?
That's okay.
So to get started, Guten Morgen, Guten Morgen, Guten Morgen all. Here.
Well, there he goes. Never mind. Here he comes back again, I think.
A quick review of what we did last week. We finished up the study of geography, the geography of Germany, of the German lands. Of course, as we know, the geography had a huge influence on German history, German culture. The principal feature of the German geography, of course, is the Great Northern Plain, the Great Northern Plain. In other words, you can go all the way across Northern Europe, way to Russia, without encountering any notable barrier, no mountain range, no ocean, just minor rivers. So that made it possible for any peoples there with a sizable military force could march back and forth, east or west, without any severe impediment. So we went into some detail in that. So today our topic is going to be, as you know, if you got my voluminous outline that was sent out yesterday afternoon. Today's topic is going to be, we're going to take a look at the pattern of German history, a bit of a philosophy of history. We're going to step back and see what is the pattern, if any, there is a pattern. The German history generally did not flow in a straight line. It swung one way and the other. Other countries, Britain, America, France, all had a very different pattern of history. They all three went in a general direction of going toward freedom for the individual. Germany swung back and forth. To just give two examples, for the last 70 years, Germany has enjoyed one of the finest democracies in the world. And immediately, just before that, Germany was governed by a Nazi dictatorship, only for 12 years, fortunately. So that was a drastic shift from one to the other. And we'll summarize that later at the end today. The swing back, the pendulum swing, if you look at it that way, of German history, fortunately, the record of the positives and the creative eras are longer than the negative and the destructive. So let's start out with, take a look at some examples of the negative periods of German history, going in reverse. World War II, the Nazi regime and World War II was, as far as I can determine, the most destructive period in entire history of Germany. It was catastrophic. Pictures. I lost my list of pictures. They're right there. So the World War II is one example. Another example is World War I, the first picture. See, yes, first picture is this map of, now this is Germany today. the borders, of course, on the small Netherlands, Belgium, France, and Poland on the east side, the Czech Republic, and Austria to the southeast. This is Germany today. During the 70 years, well, we'll skip over the Soviet occupation, but for 70 years, it's enjoyed this excellent German Republic, Federal Republic of Germany. Next picture shows just before that, the hideous period of the Nazi rule in Germany. So the pendulum swing is drastic. Let's go on to the next picture. A second negative period was World War I, which was catastrophic to the Germans also. This picture, by the way, is Kaiser Wilhelm II. He was the Kaiser, the King of Prussia, and then, no, it was Germany by this time. The German Empire. He was the Kaiser of the German Empire when World War I began. Of course, that war destroyed an entire generation of young Germans. Of course, the French and British as well. And Kaiser Wilhelm here, he actually was not a soldier, but he certainly liked dressing up. He really promoted, he loved dressing up as an army officer. And he had promoted the growth and increase of the German army, building up in those years before 1914, before the World War I began. And many historians apply some of the blame for starting World War I to the Kaiser. But I think the principal cause of World War I was the system of military buildup and the web, spider web, well, the web of alliances between allies, so that Europe was dividing. Almost every country had joined an alliance of protection to a neighbor, and that's mainly what led to the disaster, to the war that nobody really wanted. That period is explaining the alliances was beautifully explained in Barbara Tuchman's book, The Guns of August. I've mentioned that book twice earlier, but it's the best explanation I know of how the European countries stumbled into World War I. Okay, go back 250 years to another negative, destructive period. The King of Prussia, this is a portrait of King Frederick II, the King of Prussia. He was very notable as a successful king, and also the negative side was huge because of war. Frederick led the Germans into the Silesian Wars, and the Silesian Wars, 1/3, well, there was a series of 3 battles in rapid sequence, at the end of which 1/3 of his entire army lay dead on the battlefields, lost 1/3 of his army. And even worse, the civilian casualties are horrifying. 500,000 Prussians, Germans, were killed. 500,000 civilians, that is to say, 1/10 of the entire population of Prussia were killed during the Silesian Wars. That was a true disaster for the German peoples. So the German peoples have suffered severely at different times in the last 3 centuries. Okay, now we're going to So much for the negative swings of German history. Now we're going to take a look at the positive and creative periods. There were several, the Germans blossomed in several different areas. The creative genius of the Germans is really extraordinary. We're going to look at just several different areas, very different areas, where the creative genius is blossoming. Around in the next picture, we'll see, this is Johann Sebastian Bach playing the, it's not a full piano yet, but he's playing the keyboard. And you could say the birth of classical music sprung up around the year 1700, just slightly before. Bach was born in 1685. So this was I see it as the beginning of the whole new development of music. Classical music burst out in the Germanies. First of all, up at Leipzig. That's where Bach spent most of his life. What I'm going to do now is just go through some of the different areas where the German creative talent blossomed. So first there was classical music. Then Germans invented the science of historiography, the creation of history writing and research. German invented the science of meteorology, understanding of weather, climatic changes. The science of archaeology, the Germans created from scratch. The science of philology, Germans cracked the code of the cuneiform written language of of Mesopotamia. And by understanding cuneiform, that opened up, that's more than just being able to read ancient Babylonia and Sumeria, but that opened up whole unknown worlds of ancient civilizations, a huge breakthrough in human discovery, thanks to the German scientist of philology. And probably most weighty of all, the Germans, in the 19th century, Germans were the world leaders in philosophy and sciences. Now, glancing over that record, it is simply breathtaking that many gigantic figures in many different areas were Germans, came from the German world. So now to take a look at some of those in more detail, this is the classical music Baroque period. I'm going to consider Bach the principal one who begins this. So I'm going to list off some of the great, some only of the great musical composers. Then there was Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach. This was J.S. Bach's son, his son who was one of 20 children of Bach. Those are some musical enthusiasts who are not aware that Bach had 20 children. And his son Carl, who I believe is the violinist over on the left, but actually everybody in the family was a musician. They had their own orchestra, and several of them were very notable composers. Like Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach became the court composer for Frederick the Great, Frederick II. They're down in Potsdam. Other notable musical composer talents: Joseph Haydn, Mozart. The next picture will show one of the giants, namely Ludwig Beethoven. I love this manuscript behind Beethoven's head. And Beethoven, his personality was really overwhelming. He was given to outrages of anger, but he was also a real well-liked gentleman. But if you look at his manuscript, this one shows the way he composed. In other manuscripts, you see blotches of ink right on the, spattered right on the manuscript, because the way Beethoven composed, he just wrote fast as he possibly could, still not as fast as he was thinking. He would create, in his mind, have a whole composition in mind and just write it out, a script like this, just as fast as he could. And to pause a minute with Beethoven, he was especially important because he started a new direction of composing music. Well, up until this time, of composing for the community, composing for the community. Up to this time, virtually all of the great, the great composers, thinking of Joseph Haydn especially, they composed for patrons. They couldn't earn a living just composing music with no audience. So the patrons were very wealthy aristocrats, the court of wealthy noblemen, aristocrats, and wealthy merchants as well. But there were almost no concert halls for a larger public. And that's what Beethoven started. He was, he loved performing. He was a real performer, and he liked audiences, larger audiences. And so, like, he would do a performance at the in Vienna. By the way, I should mention this German genius for composing music came from the entire German language area, the German culture area. That, of course, includes Austria as well as Germany. In fact, the center for musical creativity was Vienna, Austria. So it's the larger Germany was produced these brilliant composers. So when Beethoven did his first public performances just in private palaces in Germany and Vienna, he expanded into a larger opera theater, and that still wasn't big enough. People loved him. He was really a genteel performer. And so finally, there were almost no concert halls in Germany, Austria, until Beethoven. So concert halls started popping up all over the Germanies. And this meant that not only the aristocrats could enjoy this extraordinary new music, but the middle classes could also participate because large audiences were encouraged, patronized, and so the prices were very reasonable. And even the poor classes were able to attend concerts and see concerts by Beethoven. So Beethoven really had an unusual effect on classical music. And also, just during this time, it took several stages of increasing the keyboard instrument, which was Beethoven's instrument. The harpsichord was really a medieval instrument. And there were several stages of expanding and improving the harpsichord until finally, just as Beethoven was becoming popular, finally the pianoforte came into existence. The pianoforte had the full 88 keys. It was a wider keyboard, a more powerful, energetic instrument. Of course, later on, the name just became simplified to the piano, but the true name of the instrument was the pianoforte in Europe for a long time. Can you imagine a short keyboard like the harpsichord trying to express one of Beethoven's symphonies? Beethoven's symphonies could not be contained in a narrow keyboard. So he was especially influential in changing the type of music. Okay, to continue with just a few of the outstanding composers, Franz Schubert, he produced song as well. Almost everything he composed. It's really disappointing that he died so young. I think he was 31 years old. But he and Haydn were the creators of string quartets. It happens to be my favorite, so I really approve of Schubert and Haydn. So the string quartets, and then there was Robert Schumann and his wife Clara Schumann, both brilliant composers. And I should say, Clara Schumann has been overshadowed by her husband. But Clara, and before they got married, Clara was an extraordinary, well, she was one of the most extraordinary pianists in all of Europe. And she had done tours, and her piano playing was recognized as apparently the finest concert pianist in all of Europe. Quite amazing. And she became eclipsed after they got married. Then finish up with Brahms, and a bit later, Gustav Mahler. So amazing group of musical geniuses. So that was one area of creative genius. Now let's go on to another, take a look at the science of historiography. Yeah. The next picture is going to be the man who created the history of science. I mean, of the science of writing history, research and writing. Leopold von Ranke, the first true historian of the science of history. Now, he created this himself. It's a good thing he lived to be 91 years old, because he wrote enormous number of volumes of history of different books all over Europe. But what did von Ranke invent? He realized that to be accurate, this is a very part of the German character, to be accurate and solid, history writing had to be written from original sources, primary sources, original documents. So he spent many years of his life in archives all over Europe. So he would go to archives of the royalties, dukes and kings. He would pour through orders issued by kings, by sultans, diplomats, even finance offices kept archives, even banks. So von Ranke spent a lot of time. Imagine how much work this would be to copy down all these original sources and then write his histories based on factual truth, verified sources, verified documents. He started a whole new history. There had been, before that, there had been some histories, of course, but they were not scientific, rigidly disciplined scientific research and writing. And today, that system of writing history, and it's so much that we take for granted that we forget that it was all started by this man right here, Leopold von Ranke. And then going on to another science of archaeology, this picture right here, excuse me, is a picture of ancient Troy being burned. That's one of the great stories of ancient Greek mythologies is the Trojan War. And Germans were well read, especially, and they were well informed about the mythological stories of the ancient Greeks, partly because they are so interesting in themselves, partly because the mythological stories of the ancient Greeks are a different way of teaching us life lessons, how to live a better life. Virtually all the myths carry that. That's part of the genius of ancient Greek culture, and especially of Homer, who composed the two great epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. There are reasons why Homer's epic are still read 2,800 years later today. In any case, the story of the Trojan War is one of the most important. And when Heinrich Schliemann was a boy, he's the first archaeologist, real archaeologist. His father would read stories, German stories of ancient Greece. And the story of the Iliad is the story of a 10-year battle, 10-year war right here at Troy.
Troy's here. Where's Troy?
Where is Troy? It's at the Hellespont, at the Dardanelles, present-day Turkey. It's the waterway between the Aegean Sea and the Black Sea. Well, the little boy, little Heinrich Schliemann, looked at the pictures in these books, like a picture like this one, the burning of the city of Troy after 10 years, that the Greeks finally were able to conquer the Trojans. Not by battles, because their face-to-face battles ended up as a stalemate. But how did the Greeks finally win the war? Through intelligence, wiliness. The wily Odysseus figured out how to build, the idea of building a huge wooden horse, hollow, and the Greek soldiers, the best of the warriors, got into the horse and it was taken into the city of Troy. Anyway, little Heinrich was so fascinated as a young boy that his whole life was determined. He said, you know what? I really think that there could be an actual historic place called Troy, where this Trojan War took place. That became the mission of his life. It seemed totally fanciful at first. So eventually, and he knew that he had to have a lot of money. So at first he spent years as a businessman. He went into business in Germany. He earned a huge fortune. He was very good, very clever as a businessman. Actually, a German company, trade company, had an office in, opened an office in Russia, in Moscow, and they sent Schliemann there as their financial agent. And it happened to be a very fortunate time of trade, early trade between Russia and Germany. So Schliemann earned a large fortune. So he came back to Germany, quit, and now he was able to start his life work. He, of course, had poured over the Iliad and the Odyssey, and especially the Iliad. So he went to Greece, and there was no handbook, no tourist handbook, of course, to Troy, because it didn't exist anymore. And the entire academic community insisted that the story of the Trojan War was totally made up, just a myth. That's what everybody believed at the time, except little Heinrich Schliemann. So the only guide he had was the Iliad itself. He had studied the Iliad itself, and he knew about that Troy was on a hill a couple miles from the sea, the Aegean Sea. So he traveled around, and he also knew that it was going to be at the narrows. It should be at the narrows of trade, where a city could impose taxes on any ship passing. And that's one reason that Troy was hated by a lot of the business traders from Greece. So Heinrich got permission from the Sultan of the Ottoman Empire, but they didn't care if anybody was digging in hills. So Schliemann hired a whole crew of Turkish workers, laborers, to start digging, and he found this hill. He said, "This is really a good choice. You can see all the way to the way you can see any ships coming that they could gouge for taxes," and started digging. He dug a trench, and sure enough, he found a layer of an ancient city. We're going to go to the next picture. This is the 9 different levels of ancient Troy. Not only was it an ancient city, but there were 9 different cities built one on top of the other. And here, this wonderful illustration from Smithsonian Magazine. It's a fabulous article that came out several years ago. Take a look at the one enlarged here. That is the Troy of the time of the Trojan War, the time of the Greek commander Agamemnon, the wily Odysseus. This is where Achilles, the greatest of the Greek warriors, the greatest of any warriors, spent their time fighting outside the walls. And this is called Troy 6. It's the 6th level of Troy. There are 5 more levels below. And when Schliemann started digging, by the way, the very top one up here is Troy today. But if he dug down through this, the city that was there during Roman times. And then this is unfortunate, there were no archaeologists. Schliemann was a total amateur. So he started dug down through layers 7, 8, and 9, did some damage, which of course was the other archaeologists followed right after Schliemann. We find this science of archaeology. But Schliemann dug all the way down to Troy number 2. You see the white arrow? Not that one, that's Troy 1, but Troy 2 right here. And that is way older. This one dates as far back as 2400 BC or BCE. Schliemann dug all the way down to there, found unbelievable treasury of golden objects, all kinds of golden objects, most of them in funeral burial, funeral sites. But the entire academic world was totally shocked. Actually, everybody was totally shocked that Schliemann found a city that this was an actual historic city and an actual historic war. And they could carbon date this to about 1190 BC, Troy 6, which is exactly the date that the ancients had said that the Trojan War took place. What an incredible discovery by a German genius, Schliemann. And then from here, Schliemann having become world famous for proving that some of the Greek myths were actually based on historic fact. He moved south down into southern Greece. He decided he was going to try to find the city of Mycenae. That is where Agamemnon and his lovely wife Clytemnestra ruled from. And sure enough, just by it was 10 miles inland from the Aegean Sea, just by reading the Odyssey and the Iliad, he discovered a site, started digging, and indeed he found ancient Mycenae. Also, that's where Agamemnon, by the way, one of our, if you remember the story, when Agamemnon, he was the commander-in-chief of all the Greeks at the Trojan War. And when he came back, his wife, Clytemnestra, had been living with another man. She had fallen in love with a guy named Aegisthus. And so they plotted to kill Agamemnon when he came back. Imagine the commander-in-chief of all the Greek armies came back home, and his wife spread out a red silk kind of a carpet for him to walk upon, which he said, "Oh, I don't feel right about doing this." But so he was violating, he was given into hubris. In any case, as soon as he was welcomed into the palace, taking a bath, and he was netted and stabbed to death and killed by Clytemnestra and her husband and her new lover, Aegisthus. Now the ruins are still, it's an amazing, this, by the way, this is a picture of the ruins still at Troy, showing some of the foundations of Troy II, way older. And if you look off in the distance, you can see the waters of the Hellespont, the waterway between the Black Sea and the Greek Aegean Sea. The next picture shows, this, of course, the finish up Troy. Today, there is a huge wooden horse there, a reminder of the one dreamed up by the clever Odysseus. It's still there, and tourists can climb up and go into the belly where the finest warriors were hidden. Achilles had been killed by this time, the greatest warrior, but Ajax was now the greatest warrior of all the Greeks. There was many others, Menelaus and Odysseus, of course. So now moving back to Mycenae. Yeah,
You want me to go back?
go back, please.
Sorry.
Yeah, we're going to stay here for a minute because the ruins of Mycenae today, it's pretty extensive up on a hilltop with the sea in the distance. But and there's actually guidebooks that show the blueprints of the palace at Mycenae, Agamemnon's palace. And there's a room, one of the rooms there is historians, archaeologists believe was the bath, and therefore would have been the same room where King Agamemnon was murdered. And that's one of our many field trips that we've taken, that this history class has taken. I remember that Carol Ann and Egon Steinebach, bless his soul, I love Egon, we found this room that was evidently the bath where Agamemnon was murdered. Can you imagine? And that was like 1150 BC. Imagine finding an archaeological marvel, the site where the great commander was murdered on his return home from the Trojan War. Also on that same trip, to Carolyn and Thomas Sullivan and their son, John Sullivan, there was a real star. At the battle site of the Thermopylae, he read a long poem that he had written. Anyway, this is one of the places where we went in one of our early field trips. Okay, so the science of archaeology, it began with a crude beginning of damaging parts of the different layers of Troy. But immediately other German archaeologists refined the science, and they became, along with the British, the Germans were among the prime archaeologists during that 19th century, making all these discoveries of the Mycenaean ruins and ancient Greek ruins. Okay, moving on to the next topic. Is as I mentioned, there were universities. Let's go on to Nietzsche. Okay, this is Friedrich Nietzsche, one of the great philosophers of Germany. There was for a period of time in the 19th century, Germans were leaders, world leaders in philosophy and in sciences. And after starting about the year 1830, universities popped up all over Germany. It was an amazing period of intellectual growth. There were numerous intellectual giants who came out of the new German universities. So I'm just going to mention some of the greatest of the philosophers. Immanuel Kant, early, began a whole new direction of Western philosophy. Immanuel Kant, typical German in a sense, that he was so disciplined and followed order. Order and stability was really a huge importance to the German culture. And Immanuel, the neighbors of Kant said that they could set their clocks. People had pocket watches at this time. They could set their clock on the time that Immanuel Kant opened his front door and walked out to go to work. He was that specific. Now that's just typical of Kant and some of the other German philosophers. Other great philosophers of this age, Arthur Schopenhauer, Johann Fichte, George Hegel, who created the idea of dialectical materialism. And George Hegel's pupil, Karl Marx, of course, was a German. Some people are under the illusion that he was a Russian because of Marxism taken up by Lenin, Stalin, Karl Marx. And then finally, in some ways, the most explosive of all the great German philosophers was Friedrich Nietzsche here. he was important for several reasons. His Nietzsche's philosophy was this. First of all, he was secular. He was not a Christian. In fact, he was anti-Christian. By the way, I can't do it. I was going to offer a prize to the person who could spell Nietzsche. But here's a large clue at the lower part of the picture. Nietzs. It's only the Germans could come up with a spelling like that. So Nietzsche's philosophy was that humankind, he felt humankind that were basically weaklings, and that humankind's only hope was to leap to a new species of human beings. Leap to a new species of human beings. And this would be a new, he actually called them a new Superman. How do you become one of the new Superman? Well, there were ways of strengthening your will, self-discipline, rigid discipline. One would have to rise above ordinary men. And part of this was he felt that the period of Christianity was damaging. It weakened Western culture, Western civilization. So his new race would be, he felt that Christianity produced a race of spiritless, obedient sheep. Anyway, his new race were to become a race of great warriors, highly disciplined. And he wrote several books, but one of the most important was called Thus Spake Zarathustra. It's on your outline, of course. Thus Spake Zarathustra. It was very popular, and it described these above average German that could develop in the future. That was his hope. And he gave a lot of descriptions on how to become one of the new Superman. Other book called Beyond Good and Evil, and the Antichrist. Say the name of it.
I don't know, the Antichrist.
Okay, the Antichrist or whatever, the Antichrist, and he really was the Antichrist. If the one thing that most people remember about Nietzsche, if nothing else, is that God is dead. In other words, he so disapproved of Christianity that there were different explanations. Now, to jump about 30 years later, and as I mentioned, Thus Spake Zarathustra was very popular, very widely read by German people, especially German males. 30 years later, in 1914, when Germany entered World War I, the government issued, among all the other military equipment, issued 3 books. So every soldier's knapsack had 3 books in it. One of them was Thus Spake Zarathustra by Friedrich Nietzsche, and the book which had actually inspired many of the young German men to join the military. And the other 2 books, well, another one was the New Testament, which might sound startling, but Germany was many Germans, of course, were still devout Christians, devout Lutherans. So the New Testament was necessary as for inspiration, food for the spirit, along with the book on Zarathustra. And the 3rd book was Goethe's Faust. It was the masterpiece of German literature by Germany's greatest writer. Zarathustra. Just a word about, okay, who was Zarathustra? It's a German word for the creator, the leader of an ancient religion in Persia, about 500 to 600 BC. A new religion swept, which still is alive today, believe it or not, Zoroastrianism. So Zoroaster was a great Persian religious genius, spiritual giant, whose followers became so numerous that this became a principal religion in ancient Persia. And when Persia was conquered by the Arabs, by the Muslims, and began in the year 734 when Muhammad's warriors burst out of Arabia, conquered Persia, and they imposed the new religion of Islam, Mohammedanism. Well, the religion of Zoroaster was so deeply ingrained that it could not be stamped out. And it's a religion that believes in a god of fire. So fire is an important part of every service. And when I was in Azerbaijan, in the Caucasus, I went up to a site, as I couldn't believe it. Here was a place where Zoroaster was still worshipped. It was fire, eternal fire coming out of it was a methane gas, a methane leak, or propane leak from under a huge underground deposit that was spouting up, and it was burning. It had been burning for 150 years straight. So imagine being able to see one of the sites where the ancient Zoroastrian religion is still conducted. And I know that there are still parts of Iran where that religion still thrives. In any case, to the readers of Thus Spake Zarathustra, the whole generation of young Germans had a powerful influence. And then jump ahead again to the 1930s, the 1940s, these ideas of anti-Christian, new superhuman became very popular again as the Aryan super race was cultivated by the Nazi party in Germany in the 1930s and 40s. So bottom line, Friedrich Nietzsche had an enormous influence. Here was a philosopher, a philosophy that really changed history. German, as I mentioned, Germans were world leaders in many of the sciences also, besides philosophy. Just to, in passing, mention a few, the science of medicine was advanced mostly by German medical scientists. Physiology, biology, chemistry, physics, all of these sciences were led by German intellectuals. German. Now here's a piece of evidence to support that. In a 20-year period in Germany, German scientists were making 70 new medical discoveries to only 55 by the entire rest of the world. So German scientists had made 70 of the major medical discoveries as opposed to 55 for the entire rest of the world. That is an extraordinary tribute to the intellectual genius of Germans. Another I'm not sure this is on the outline, but another, the science of meteorology, yeah, it is. The science of meteorology was developed by one man, Alexander von Humboldt. He was a great German explorer, scientist, naturalist. And his story is so large, we're going to go into it in more detail. But in our history, oh God, thank you. This is Alexander von Humboldt. And here's also a picture of him with a ship. He spent many years in South America. He had two great journeys, South America and out to Central Asia, where he was determined to study the weather, all the elements, and he was able to create a science of weather and climate changes. But just one example, in South America, he invented several instruments also to record different features of the weather. He climbed to the top of the Andes. He spent many, many months at climbing in the Andes. And what he did, as this picture is very good, he made studies. He was a genius at botany also, and the animal species. And he recorded hundreds of plants, animals as he went along. He would stop at different elevations going up the Andes and make all kinds of recordings, recordings of the fog, the mist, the amount of rain, seasonal rains, snowfall. By the time he was finished in South America, he also did studies through Central America. He wanted to come home by way of Washington, D.C. But his studies created a whole new science of study of weather and even weather predicting. But his story is so huge. In our history book club a few years ago, we read the book called Invention of Nature, Alexander von Humboldt's New World. Fascinating book about a gigantic figure. And I'm going to add that to our suggested reading list, by the way, which people keep suggesting interesting new books, and I keep coming up with one. So it could be, I'm hoping within a couple of weeks to get the expanded reading list finished. So in short, what we've looked at today are just some of the many creative geniuses that Germany produced in the last 3.5 centuries. As for a summary, finish up this next thing, but in brief, you could say that the German people, as well as I mentioned, the stream of German history has not been a single stream with a single goal. But the Germans have embraced order and authority without totalitarianism. Also, they've produced freedom and equality without a liberal democracy until our generation. But Germany's political state has been, as I mentioned, very different from the British, American, and French, which did have a straight line stream.
Want me to go back to you? Want me to go back to you?
Yes. So in short, the political history of Germany is very different from many others that we are more familiar with. I'm going to quote a notable historian of Germany, Stephen Ozment. I'm going to quote him, his observation, which is a good insight. He says the historical experience of Germany have left the German people more fearful of anarchy than tyranny. Therefore, the Germans have been in a close competition. The Germans have tended to hedge on the side of good order, discipline, stable government. And a concluding summary of the German thought, the Germans have tended to have had belief that it was not freedom, but discipline that keeps a people free. It's not freedom, but discipline that keeps a people free. So order, stability, regulations, and rules have been part of the German character. I'm going to finish up with a personal anecdote. Diane and I, there's a couple that have lived in the Metau for several years, a decade or so. And we did a lot of good friends, did several field trips around the area with them. But we were, can't remember what town it was, a medium-sized town, a city. And we were standing at a street corner in town. The green light, red light, and the green light had turned to red. But
the walk and the don't walk sign.
This is, yeah, the walk and the don't walk sign. And I looked around and left and right. There were not a car anywhere in sight. No danger of being hit by a car, no possibility. And so the three of us, the lady was, grew up in Germany. The three of us walked across the red light, seeing that it was totally safe. We got across the street and noticed that she was still standing on the street corner. She was standing on the street corner. She would not step into the street while the light was red, the do not walk. That struck me as being, well, she was so German. Anyway, that's one example.
Don't tell her.
Okay, now, now we have time for a few questions and or observations.
You can unmute yourself if you want to ask.
Yeah, if you want to ask a question. I don't know if anybody has written in any.
They haven't.
Yeah, so you can either, you can unmute yourself if you have a question or an observation.
Bill, you didn't mention Wagner.
Wagner.
Oh, thank you, Dottie. Dottie, by the way, who has lived in Germany a long time. Her husband was a medical doctor in Germany. Wagner, of course, is a genius of opera. You're right, that's a whole nother area. As I mentioned, there were many other gigantic figures that we didn't have time to mention. Yeah, Wagner was worshipped, and also Verdi.
Verdi was German.
Oops, forget that. He was Italian. We do not want.
We don't want to miss this thing.
Yeah.
No Italians.
Yeah, no, right. So we just delete that. We'll stick with Wagner. Great composer.
I have a brief observation.
Okay, just, oh, John, this is
Yeah.
John Holly. Go ahead, John.
Well, Friedrich de Grosse himself was a composer.
Oh, good. Yes.
Oh yeah, he was quite a composer. I rather like his music too. He's not very well known as a composer, but I think he spent a lot of time just outside the city in a place called Rheinsberg. He had a kind of a small palace out there on a small lake. And I think that's where he composed a lot of his music. That's where I bought the CD anyway.
Wow. Uh-huh.
Yeah,
Yeah, that's great. John used his German name. That's Frederick II or Frederick the Great, the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great. And his palace was out at what's near Potsdam.
that's
famous-
right.
Near Potsdam. And the palace is called Sanssouci.
Oh, that's a different one. That's different. Sanssouci, yeah, without care.
Yeah, Sanssouci.
Yeah.
Oh, and he held a lot of concerts at Sanssouci. Well, in both places, then both of his palaces.
Uh-huh.
But yeah, and he was a composer, and the entire court attended his performances. Some were better than others, but it was a forced audience. In fact, some of the critics said that he didn't play. What was his instrument? I'm trying to remember. Was it violin?
He played the flute, I believe he played.
Oh,
the
yes,
flute.
yes. Yeah, he was a flautist. Yeah, Frederick the Great played the flute. But some of the observers mentioned that some of his performances, he was pretty bad on the flute. But the audience applauded anyway.
And I bet it was a full house every time.
It was a full house. Yeah. That's great. Thank you, John. Any other observation?
Bill, this is Kathleen Havens,
Oh, yeah.
and I missed that third book, Nietzsche and the New Testament. But didn't you say there was another
Yes.
popular literary book?
Yeah. This is Kathleen Havens. Yeah, the third book was a book called Faust by Goethe.
Mm.
Goethe, Goethe, the greatest of German authors. Just another a literary genius that we didn't have time to mention. Faust is considered the masterpiece of German literature. Yeah, that reminds me. Nietzsche was such a cantankerous toad. Somebody asked him about the language, about literature. He said, well, the German language is really a lousy language, if you want to know the truth. He didn't like it. Coming from a German, that's pretty
Inviting.
pretty startling. But he was right. The German literature was not their strong point up until the time of Goethe. The Sorrows of the Young Werther is a short novel, another masterpiece by Goethe. The three books in the knapsacks. Any other observations?
Bill, so Frederick II, the flutist, he engaged in that Silesian Wars.
Right here.
Again, which countries were involved in that?
Okay. Oh, yes. So Silesia is down in the southeastern edge of Germany, the Silesian Mountains. So a minor mountain range.
Okay.
And that was part of a larger war. In Europe, it's called the 7 Years' War. Over in the colonies, it was called the French and Indian War. But Great Britain, it was one of these huge world wars between Britain and France. But many other countries were brought in as allies on one side or the other. Most of the European countries sided with France, but Prussia, the King of Prussia, Frederick the Great, decided to side with Britain. They had some generous perks that they offered. So that was the big picture was the 7 Years' War, which was in fact a world war. The smaller picture involving the Germans, a lot of the fighting was down there in southeast of what is now Germany, Silesia. I think that's still in Germany, on the border with Austria.
Okay,
Yeah. Any other?
thank you.
Thank you. That was Tanya and Bjorn. Any other thoughts?
Hey, Bill, it's Richard.
Oh, Richard Wasson. Yeah. Hi, Richard.
Had a question about the man you spoke of there near your end of the talk, the meteorologist.
Oh, yes.
Was the Hubble telescope named after him?
No.
Um,
Wasn't his last name something von Hubble?
oh, yes, yeah. It's Alexander von Humboldt. Thank you for bringing him up. He was such a gigantic figure that it's hard to explain him in a short account, but he was
It's not the Hubble telescope.
Humboldt. He was
Somebody
he was extraordinarily famous in his own day. That we know about Humboldt County in California, named for this genius, and
really?
the Humboldt Current in the Pacific coast off the Americas, the Humboldt Current. But that's about the only recollection that we have. He was one of the great men of history in several different areas, but he's forgotten. One of the forgotten men of history. Thank you for reminding us. And in Europe at the time, like his discoveries were so extraordinary, scientific discoveries, and he invented and built himself many different instruments, I think I mentioned, for recording the weather. He was actually he was as famous as Napoleon in that day. Yes.
But did he
Alexander-
build a telescope?
Oh, the telescope, I don't know if
It's a different name, Hubble telescope.
okay, the telescope is the Hubble telescope.
HUBBL.
Right. But did he make a telescope himself? Was that one of the instruments he made?
No,
Since he
no.
was observing weather.
I'm sure he used telescopes, yes.
He didn't invent it.
No, the inventor, or the Hubble himself, was a great astronomer who was pretty much forgotten. So it was a nice tribute to name the Hubble telescope. Totally different person. Humboldt was one of the great forgotten figures of history. Anybody else? Yeah, thank you, Richard. Anybody else have an observation?
Let's see. Mary Jane Curie.
Okay, what is it?
Gotta go. Whoop.
You can read it.
Yeah, we have a question here. No, it's an observation from Mary Jane Perry. I'm reading it. The Germans were leaders in agricultural science. Justus Freiherr von Liebig, who lived in the first half of the 19th century, this age of intellectual giants, the first half of the 19th century, figured out that the crop yield was related to soil nutrients, particularly nitrogen and phosphorus. Later in the 19th century, Germans at Kiel were the world leaders in marine sciences, all good, and established the first marine lab. So this is, Mary Jane is a professor of marine science herself, so she knows. So that's two areas, the world leaders at marine science and in soil, crop yield and soil. Good. I'm going to record that later. So, Mary Jane, can you send an email with that? I didn't know about, I had forgotten or didn't know about the study of the soils. That was hugely important. The importance of nitrogen in the soil.
Let's stop.
Thank you, Mary Jane.
Let's stop.
And finally, any last question or observation?
I'll veto say.
No? Okay, good. Well, Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.
Auf Wiedersehen.
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 Wiedersehen alle.
Ja.
You. Bye.
Wiedersehen alle.